to the Fantasy Source Baseball Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with Matt Lutovsky. And today, Matt, we're talking about keepers.
That's right.
Fantasy baseball keepers.
Yes, I updated on our site the top 125 keepers. We do it every year at the All-Star break, usually
And you
a couple
people
times.
better be grateful that he did all that work for you.
It really should be. But no, it's always fun to do, but it's also very tough to do because there are so many different ways to look at keepers and define keepers. I think when you hear it, the initial reaction is to think real long-term, and you get really excited about Strasburg and Hosmer and these guys. But when we do it, we slant it more towards the short term, specifically next year. And that will always kind of skew things and change things up.
Now, I'll say one of the things that struck me about this list that we were looking at is that, yes, it primarily looks like a list of guys who are really good this year. And, of course, it'll be thrown off in your particular league by your particular league rules. For instance, I'm in a league that's an auction league, and you pay the amount of money that you paid for the guy in future years. Therefore, since my team bought Steven Strasburg for $3 this past year, we could potentially have him for very cheap next year, considering that he'd probably go for somewhere around 20 in that league if he were out in the open. So that's a good value for us. Therefore, my team is almost certainly going to be keeping him, even though he's not very high on this list. And there are probably other players on this list that are higher up.
Right, no, exactly. And that's what makes it tough. Like, you look at some of the pitchers who are always very tough to do. You know, I think our first one is Halladay at 13, which, you know, tough to complain with him.
But see, I mean,
he's
like
34.
That exactly is the sort of thing that'll throw you off. In any league that has some kind of penalty attached to a high draft pick or a high auction value guy being kept, you have to consider, you know, Roy Halladay. Do I want to keep him? Again, that same league where I bought Steven Strasburg and I'm going to keep him. I also bought Roy Halladay for $40 in a $160 league. So I'm almost certainly not going to keep him next year, no matter how good I think he's going to be, just because he was a huge expenditure, and I'm not sure that I'm ready to sink that amount of money into my budget next year already.
Right, and then you have leagues, obviously the equivalent, like in a draft league where you give up the draft pick. Now there you might be, even if he was a first round pick, something really high, you might say, well, he's a first round pick again, so maybe I'll do it. You know, then but even then, you're still probably more likely to keep Alexi Ogando, who you got off the free agent wire or something like that, which, again, makes it very tough to rank these guys. But we're slanting it toward next year heavily, so that's why you'll see some veterans on there higher than some youngsters. Like, I think Eric Hosmer is one of our highest ranked young. He's in the 70s, you know,
right.
that type of thing.
And the key to him is that he came up relatively early compared to all those other guys that you might be looking at as keepers. So here's what I want you to talk about a little bit, Matt, are some of the guys who have changed a lot since the last time we did this. I mean, one of the things that we were talking about before the show that this list that you've just published is going to be very useful for people is to get an idea of how things have changed from the beginning of the season till now. So from the last time we did this, who would you think might be the most interesting people that have moved up or moved down?
Well, we'll start right at the top. Jose Bautista, number 1, which I'm still not sure if people totally buy into him. Like, totally buy it, like the way they just,
You mean that he's hitting like Babe Ruth?
Right. But, you know, it's like with Pujols or even like Cabrera or even Votto. I feel people are just like, yeah, Votto, great, top 10 guy, great. There's still some people who might be a little skeptical of Bautista. We're not. We're all in. When we last did this list in the offseason, he was 33. Now he's 1. And honestly, I didn't give it much thought.
Is that related at all to his third base eligibility?
That helps. I mean, that's a ton to get. You know, third base, you look at it right now, and a lot of it's due to injuries. Zimmerman, Wright, A-Rod, some other guys like that. Third base has become a very weak position, just kind of like all of a sudden.
I mean, really Ryan Roberts is a perfectly logical third baseman now, and he's like, in real life, he's been pretty good, but in fantasy, it's the fact that he has 10 steals, oh my gosh.
Yeah, so Bautista getting in at third is big, and then you go down the list a little more. You know, we have Adrian Gonzalez 2, he jumped up. Now we've kind of seen him in Boston. We know it's all legit. Kemp jumped up a bunch of spots, he's 3. Pujols, down from 1 to 5. You could probably argue he should be further down the list. But we still, you know, we're going to give him respect he deserves and what he's done throughout his whole career. But he's still in there at 5. But then you look at a guy like Jose Reyes, who I think is very interesting. Before this year started, it is a no-brainer. Tulowitzki's better than Jose Reyes. Hanley Ramirez is better than Jose Reyes. I mean, there's people that you probably could have found people who would have rather have had Elvis Andrus than Jose Reyes.
Oh, yeah.
And now he's playing out of his mind. Now, on the DL right now, which kind of limits his value right now, we still have him third of those top-tier shortstops. We have him 10th overall behind Tulowitzki and Hanley.
And those guys are ranked right next to each other in your overall
8, 9, 10,
list, too.
which is right down that line. But it's just interesting how much things can change in a year, how quickly things can change. You know, Jacoby Ellsbury jumping way up.
Well, what about the guys
like that?
What about the guys who have dropped down way more than perhaps we thought they would? I think I saw who was it? Ryan Howard, I think, has dropped a significant amount in this list, even though as someone whose real life value, I mean, if you're a Fangraphs reader, you're well aware of a lot of the limitations of Ryan Howard and his huge contract and so on and so forth. But in the fantasy world, he's been consistent, and everybody only really cares about the counting stats, so roll with it.
Yeah, no, he has fallen. He's down to 32, and a lot of that's a product of age. I mean, I just look at him as a guy who's going to keep declining. He still provides, a very good production for what he does, but I think you look at some of the other guys at other positions, first base is stacked. The fact that Paul Konerko is still doing what he's doing at his age, we look at some of these young guys coming up, even throw Gabby Sanchez in there, but Freeman, Trumbo, some of these guys who are playing really well. Hosmer, who's really coming up the pipeline. I just don't see any reason to invest heavily in Ryan Howard, like to really invest a lot in him. And so he's fallen down the list. I think another guy too, A-Rod. He's down to 38 now on this list, and a big reason for that is injury concerns. I mean, this is fourth straight year he's had that DL stint? I mean, that's at a certain point, and you look at him, 35, it adds up. You have to take it into account, and he's fallen down that list, even at a really thin position.
I mean, if he's not stealing 10, 12, 15 bases a year and his home runs drop from 35 to 28, all of a sudden you're talking about a guy who's more in line with the sub-all-star level guys.
Right. And another guy who really fell, go to the pitching side, Josh Johnson, who I love, but he's very quietly becoming a new Jake Peavy, a new Rich Hart. And again, these injuries are piling up. You can't ignore them. And they're there all the time. And therefore, he's going to fall because he's just not as trustworthy as some of these other pitchers. And to be fair to him, though, last year at this time, I thought Adam Wainwright was as sure of a thing. This guy's going to throw 220 innings for the next decade, and Tommy John. So pitchers are very tough to predict in general, no matter who they are, unless it's like Sabathia or Halladay.
So is there anybody that you can think of off the top of your head that you looked at this list and you say, you know what, his placement might actually be kind of controversial, whether he's too high, too low compared to what the general consensus says that he is?
Well, Danny Espinosa at 52. Might seem really high.
Yeah, I mean, especially for a guy who, even as a rookie, is hardly a household name in even fantasy circles.
Yeah, but I just look at him, and you're talking legit. To me, he's basically in Kinsler, and he obviously plays in a much worse park that Kinsler played in, but he has that same type of potential. And Kinsler really broke out because he had kind of 1 year with a really high average. But he's not an average hitter. Espinosa really isn't an average hitter, but you're talking 2020, potentially more, 2030 potential from a second baseman. I think is really good. He's only 24, so he was a guy that I kind of favored and put pretty high on the list. And I think when you get on the lower end of the list, there's guys like, Moustakas, we just slotted in last slot, 125. Obviously much higher potential than that, but we just really haven't seen it at the major league level, so we can't get too excited about him quite yet.
Right, the guys like Dustin Atley and Mike Moustakas who are just coming up now, I think that the key takeaway from where you put them on the list here at 124 and 125 is that it's very exciting to keep those guys.
Right.
And you feel like, and if it works out, you were right.
Yeah.
You get to tell everyone, I was right, I saw it before any of you did, I took a chance and I won out. But the thing is that the boring choice is almost certainly going to be better. Because, if as good as Atley is, are you really going to say, are you really going to put it down, put your reputation, put your fantasy team's fortunes on him outperforming, let's say, just off the top of my head, Neil Walker? Someone like that who's a middle-of-the-road starting fantasy second baseman.
Who's ahead of him on this list at 104.
For exactly that reason, because Walker probably wasn't drafted all that highly.
Right.
He's probably going to be valued roughly the same as Atley.
He's boring.
And he's boring. He's the boring guy who just does what he does.
Well, the interesting guy to me on this list is Pablo Sandoval, who I think when we did it 2 years ago, he was in like the 30s.
Yes.
Off the list when we did it last year. And now he's back. We slotted him in at 103. But that's another good one. Compare him to Moustakas. Mm-hmm. Which guy are you taking? I think most people are going to say, I've seen Sandoval stink. I'm going Moustakas. But we've also seen Sandoval be really, really good.
He hit over 330 that year.
Right, and he's hitting over 300 now. He's back from injury. So those are kind of the tough choices, and that's what this list is really here to help you with. Those types of choices you can say. Don't take the ranking as gospel. Don't say, hey, he's 82. That means he's the 82nd best keeper. But use it to compare similar guys, similar positions. I think it'll help you that way.
All right, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
All right.